The Infill Challenge is a competition, aka challenge, for the development of new models of sensitive infill housing in select areas of Kelowna's urban core. This approach is a first for the City of Kelowna. This session will explore some of the reasons that infill housing is important, the rationale behind the approach of the Infill Challenge, and it will share some details about the project itself. The speaker is James Moore. He is an experienced urban planner and is currently part of the leadership team of the Policy and Planning Department at the City of Kelowna. He's an advocate for finding creative solutions to some of the city's most challenging issues, including encouraging sustainable growth and creating vibrant urban centers. Please welcome James.
Thank you, Brigitte. First off, it is kind of an intimidating field here. When you get introduced, especially after the lineup we've had before, I have credential inadequacy complex right now. I feel like, is it actually okay to invent a PhD if I didn't do one? So I have the somewhat unenviable job of keeping you guys from thinking about food for the next 45 minutes. I did just say food, so good luck there. So again, I'm James Moore. I work in the Policy and Planning Department at the City of Kelowna. And I will note that I'm not an academic, which is convenient for me because it means that I'm not bound by the shackles of facts. So, again, I'd like to thank UBCO Okanagan for inviting me to be part of this symposium. Today I'm going to talk to you a bit about a project that we're working on called the Infill Challenge. It's a process that's definitely ongoing, so it's in that ongoing frame that I'd like you to consider this presentation. So I thought we could start off with a quote here. Learning and innovation go hand in hand, and the arrogance of success is to think that what you did yesterday will be sufficient for tomorrow. I think that speaks to how cities are constantly evolving and changing, and that our practice as planners and other related professionals needs to change along with them. So to establish some common ground here, I have a very simple working definition of infill housing that I wanted to share with you guys. The way I approach infill housing is by it's the addition of new housing units in an existing neighborhood. And I want to provide some background and context to help frame why infill housing is important. So I'm going to talk a bit about how we got here, and I'll argue that the dominant housing force that has shaped North American cities, including Kelowna, is one of suburban sprawl. I'll talk a bit about where we're at today and how sprawl has impacted Kelowna. And then I'll talk about the Infill Challenge and how infill housing can inform a vision for the future. So to begin, the 1950s onward saw a major shift in Canadian cities. I've called it the flight from the center, but others have called it suburban exodus and other names as well. Essentially, the boundaries of cities suddenly expanded as people left the core. In city evolutionary times, this actually happened really rapidly. It wasn't a slow trickle over hundreds of years as some other city processes are, but it was actually a significant migration that happened in just a few decades. So what might have caused this? Well, naturally, in doing my dedicated academic research into this, I looked at Twitter and found some really interesting things. So I'd like to, any historians in the room should really pay attention because things are about to get real. Apparently, people left the center because of a sudden outbreak of mom jeans. Of bad haircuts, and in case people didn't realize, I didn't know this happened, there was actually a zombie apocalypse. So that really drove people right out of the center. But there are actually a variety of real reasons that people left our urban cores. And the first one is economic. Really, the post-war era saw the unleashing of new disposable income that had been pent up for years during the Great Depression and during the war and rationing, and suddenly that income became available in the post-war economic boom, and that expressed itself in housing. Demographics also were a major factor into the genesis of suburban sprawl as we know it today, as returning veterans and the following baby boom demanded huge amounts of new housing. And another key element to this was what I've called structural, and I'd argue in this case that it's government programs that subsidized and supported suburban housing in an effort to try and meet that huge housing demand. But there's another piece to this picture, I think, and it's one that involves our own perceptions. And this is an image that might be evocative of what maybe people think of as the American dream. Maybe an expression of our collective values, of our collective desires. And that's a really important driver behind suburban expansion. But in that picture, there's another really, really important piece of the reason behind suburban sprawl, and that is the advancement of the automobile. I'd argue that this is the single most powerful reason why suburban sprawl happened. Suddenly, the American dream, this kind of detached house with a white picket fence and a dog and all that kind of stuff, was within reach. We could all have our peaceful country house on a hill. But despite their lofty vision, this is what they got. They got the sprawling suburbs. And just in case there are some of you in here who maybe are wondering what I'm saying when I say suburbs, I define suburbs as being low density, usually residential, but not exclusively, single use, auto-dependent areas. And the very cars that opened up the possibility of this American dream created environments like this. And the kinds of communities they got resulted in lower physical health, social isolation, and paved over farmland and forest. And the trouble is that this kind of development forces you into a bit of a vicious cycle, one in which you begin to believe that only the tax benefits of new growth will pay for the costs created by past growth. This is an image, it might be hard for you guys to read. It's an image actually out of a book that one of my colleagues at the city pulled out from, it was about to be a record about to be destroyed. And it's a book from the 1960s by a couple of planners who took a satirical look at planning in the 60s. And I'll read you the excerpt there. It says, "Many planners are of the opinion that growth and more growth is the only solution to our urban problems. The logic behind this idea is obvious. Only more growth will supply the tax money needed to solve the problems created by past growth." And I thought, first off, we hear that all the time, and that was 50 years ago. So a pretty remarkably permanent kind of thinking that's really ingrained itself throughout cities and the way we think about cities over the past 50 years, and we're still trying to combat that today. Well, after 40 to 50 years of suburban growth, we now realize we've seen the light. We now realize the error of our ways. We know that what we thought was going to deliver us the ideal dream life really delivers placeless and unhealthy environments, environmental degradation, social isolation, and infrastructure chaos. And in the end, those just suggest that we're not all that happy in the suburbs. So where are we today? Well, the decades in which suburban development was at its peak also happened to coincide with rapid urbanization in Canadian cities. Canada is now supposedly 81% urban. But I argue that the majority of that is actually suburban development, particularly in cities like Kelowna and cities like Kelowna across Canada that really grew principally during the era in which suburban development was at its peak. I'd argue that a large share of the physical and social infrastructure of Canadian cities has, to a large degree, been shaped by suburban growth, and Kelowna is definitely no exception. One of the easiest ways I've found to identify suburban development in a city is to look at its road network. So I've identified here some of the central core of Old Kelowna, and what you can maybe take away from this is you can look and there's a grid network. And that grid network looks something like this on the ground. What's great about that is it has this kind of plug-and-play flexibility that allows you, as a city evolves, to put in a bunch of different uses and densities, so they're really flexible over time. You can have row housing, you can have apartments, you can have commercial, you can have all kinds of uses in those places, and they still function really well. Conversely, if we look at a Kelowna example from the air, here's a physical layout of suburban development. Curvilinear road networks with frequent cul-de-sacs are one of the defining features of suburban development. And much more of Kelowna is set up this way. In fact, I would argue that many of you currently live in or grew up in a house in one of these areas. Anybody want to vouch for that? Hands up for people who grew up in a suburban house. Yeah, you did. These environments are really highly inflexible. They can't easily evolve with a city, unlike their older neighbors. But if planners and citizens and governments have figured out that suburban sprawl is no good, what is the alternative? I think we've all heard about it. The alternative is a network of denser, more diverse, vibrant places anchored by mixed-use centers. We all like these. I bet if you walked around and read the official community plans of cities across North America, most of them would say something like that. And they'd say that because there are all kinds of benefits to densification. We get greater social interaction. There are more of us in a smaller space, so we see each other more often, we interact more often. Because we're closer to things we need, we're more physically active. And one of the interesting things about suburbs is that we've really designed physical activity out of our days, and now we go to gyms to try and put it back in. They're more fiscally sustainable, both for people who live there, because maybe you don't need a second car, and that income goes back into your pocket. For municipalities, they have a smaller footprint, so they're much more fiscally sustainable for taxpayers and municipalities who don't have to pay for that kind of infrastructure to expand forever and ever into the periphery. And again, because more and more people are interacting and bumping into each other and sharing their ideas, they tend to be more culturally vibrant. But as much as I hate to say it, there's no silver bullet that's going to take us in one giant leap from the sprawling cities we have to a city with dense, diverse, and vibrant centers. I can say with some certainty, though, that bringing more density into our central areas is a key part of that strategy. And that means infill housing. The addition, again, of new units into existing neighborhoods. Those new units can take a whole variety of forms depending on what context is appropriate. You can see the graph here. On the far left-hand side, you can see single detached houses. On the far right-hand side, you can see mid-rise apartments and higher. And that's the kind of vocabulary that exists predominantly in most cities, and it's the same in Kelowna. If you look at Kelowna as an example, 51% of all dwelling units in Kelowna are single detached houses, and a large share of the remainder would be apartment buildings. What we're missing is, again, called the missing middle. It's forms like duplexes, triplexes and fourplexes, bungalow courts, row housing, all that kind of stuff. They're really underrepresented in the vocabulary of housing in cities like Kelowna, and cities that grew up in the era of suburban sprawl. But there are signs of hope that this kind of development in our cities is increasing. In Kelowna, for instance, we've seen recently a far increased demand for multi-unit development. Each year we track the balance of building permits, and this year our balance was 60% multi-unit and 40% single, and that's a major achievement for Kelowna, and I hope that continues into the future. Many of the same social forces that aligned in favor of suburban development in the post-war era are now aligning against it. And I've heard that through some of the presentations we heard earlier today about baby boomers wanting to downsize, young people wanting to be part of urban life. There are also social trends here that are aligning in favor of urban development and infill housing. For instance, take a look at car ownership. Car ownership has been now declining among young people for a few years now and appears to be continuing to do so. No longer is the ownership of a car a defining feature of prosperity. But I think it's more important than ever that as municipalities and local governments that we capitalize on these changes and make sure our cities are ready for infill housing. So if we know infill housing is important and the start seem to be aligning for it, why isn't it taking over? Why don't we see that everywhere? Well, I think there are a lot of things in the way of infill housing, a lot of things that make it hard. And the first one of these is a deep-set belief in a lot of us that goes back to this deep-rooted concept of whether you want to call it the American dream or something else. This notion that the apex of the housing pyramid is a single detached house, that we haven't really achieved success until we own a single detached house. I'd argue that that is still an extremely powerful driver in the minds of many of us. A second, and this was noted in some of the earlier discussions as well, is a fear of change. And I always find this kind of interesting. When you talk to people about change in a neighborhood, they forget that the house they owned was a change for the people before them. When they moved into that neighborhood, that was a change. And for some reason, there's a psychological break where now when somebody else wants to move into my neighborhood, the door is shut. There's a sense that all change is bad in existing neighborhoods. The third, and this again harkens back to some of the discussion earlier, is that there are systems, powerful systems and processes and infrastructure that have been established over the past 50 years that make the old way of doing things really easy. We're great at building this, we're great at financing this, we're great at marketing this, and we're great at selling this. And that takes a long time to change. Conversely, here's the kind of stuff we want. We want those dense, vibrant urban centers. Well, building there is inherently more complex and more difficult. And the last is the old concept of the squeaky wheel. Resistance in a neighborhood, in an established neighborhood, is much more likely than it is in a field or a forest. And I think sometimes residents have a good reason to mistrust infill housing. This is an example from Saskatoon, not that I'm picking on Saskatoon. Planners haven't always been, and I suppose councils as well, haven't always been the best at making sure that infill is sensitive. I'd love to read the council minutes of a public hearing that this went to. I think part of the reason behind that is that as planners, we get used to seeing the city in the abstract. We get used to viewing the city from 20,000 feet. We start to buy into the idea of sweeping transformation, that we get to put an old neighborhood with all its idiosyncrasies into the planning black box, and out will pop a wonderful, shiny new neighborhood, and that'll happen just overnight. And the trouble is that's held true for a long time of suburban development, where you see suddenly out of nowhere comes a new neighborhood. But that doesn't hold true so well for infill housing. Established neighborhoods, change can be painfully slow. It can take 30, 40, or even 50 years for a neighborhood to change over completely. And if you don't manage that change, quality of life for both residents there today and future residents can suffer. To succeed in infill housing, I believe that you need a balanced approach that embraces density, but not at the expense of the character of existing neighborhoods. So when we looked at this in Kelowna, being planners, we naturally thought that we had all the answers. And I quickly discovered that we didn't. We knew there were great ideas out there. This is a concept out of West Vancouver called Hollyburn Mews. Each one of those units looks like a traditional single detached house, but it's actually a duplex, and they have a carriage house in the rear. So you get 3 units where we typically provide 1. This is just another example of an infill house on a narrow lot in Saskatoon. When we looked into how we could do infill housing in Kelowna, we also knew that imposing a solution was not a solution at all, and that we'd have to find a solution along with a wide variety of partners. If we were going to try and chart a new path for infill housing, we were going to have to put our best house forward. So we landed on the idea of a design competition, and that is the root of the infill challenge itself. It's a design competition. Out of this, we needed to show the development community that infill housing can work on their pro formas, and to show residents that it won't bring on the next apocalypse. So what are competitions good for? Well, they're good for a lot of things. They're good for bringing out the best. If you want to find the fastest runner in your city, it's probably not the best idea to hold an open house or to maybe put out a survey. Not the best way to find your fastest runner. Probably the best way to do that is to hold a race. So they're great at bringing out the best. They're great at stimulating innovation. When you get those ideas competing for each other, you get the best ideas that come out on top, and they build on each other, and you get new stuff that builds innovation. When you get people coming into that, you get to read the market. You get to read whether there's a sense among the development community of whether infill housing is going to sell and what kinds of infill housing is going to sell. And you can assure that when it's brought forward, it will be applicable on the ground. Those are all things that are hard for us to do as planners from City Hall. But competitions don't do everything well. They can bring out the best, but they're not all that great at helping us collaborate. They're not all that great at helping us see the points of view of other people, or helping us build consensus, or helping us strengthen relationships. And those are all things that are really important as we do our work in established neighborhoods. There's social capital, there are relationships in those neighborhoods that are important to keep strong as infill housing happens. So if we just go in and build the best, those relationships, without any consideration for collaboration, those relationships can be broken. So how is it that we can get the best of both worlds? Well, we crafted a process in the Infill Challenge. I'm not saying it's a perfect process, but we crafted a process that tried to involve both the broader community as well as developers in the competition itself. So we started with a community panel. And I thought there was an interesting point made earlier by a member of the audience who talked about the voice of people who aren't in those neighborhoods yet. I think that's an important voice to have at the table. We didn't want to set up a panel with just existing residents so we can just hear about concerns about infill housing. We wanted to hear from other residents, other stakeholders who can share their optimism about what it means to be able to move into a neighborhood that they can't right now. So we broadened that community panel, started with them and worked with them to set the rules of the competition and to determine what success looked like. Then we opened the doors to the private sector to bring us their best ideas to read the market and to make sure those ideas are applicable on the ground. And then we finished off the process by bringing the community back in a couple of different ways. First with an evaluation committee that would help us select the top submissions, and that evaluation committee again would have representatives from a wide variety of stakeholders, including residents from existing neighborhoods. And then through council approval, another venue for community input. So what are the key objectives and outcomes of the Infill Challenge project? Well, first, the objectives. We wanted to set a new bar, to set a new high standard for the design of infill houses. I'm sure that through any city you drive through, you can go through and you can see examples of infill housing gone wrong, and Kelowna certainly isn't an exception to that. You can do that around here as well. But we wanted to set a new standard, a new bar for the design of infill housing. We wanted to identify new ideas that we haven't seen here, that haven't been built on the ground in Kelowna. And we also wanted to do that while building to support both in the development community and in existing neighborhoods and among potential residents as well. Out of this, we're hoping to get new designs, revised zoning regulations, and a package of incentives to make sure that these are allowed to happen on the ground quickly. So how do we go about this? Well, we started the Infill Challenge with 2 broad workshops with that community panel. And again, we had representatives at that panel from Interior Health, the school district, UBCO, Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, residents, neighborhood associations, all kinds of people at that panel. And we armed them with a bunch of background research and best practices and information about the neighborhoods that they were talking about. And together we set out the terms of the competition and defined success. The key elements that would make great infill housing according to this group were all about design. they really weren't all that concerned about how many units you packed on that site. They were concerned about how the design of that site fit within its context. Context was a really key element of this discussion. So was building massing in bulk. So was having an open and positive relationship to the street for new housing, as well as generous private space and the protection of mature trees. So those were all major factors that this community panel decided on. So we took that and we crafted a competition, and we launched that competition in November of 2015 and held it open for a couple of months, and we closed it on January 11th of 2016 and received a total of 10 submissions. And I'm just going to share very quickly here a small snapshot of a few of the submissions we received. This isn't they don't reflect any personal bias about these submissions because, again, the competition is still open. It's just a selection of a couple of the images that we got, and I'll share with you briefly what each project proposes. By the way, all the projects are taking place on a standard urban lot, 50 by 120, so they're all competing on the same playing field. This is a duplex in the front of the lot, so you can see 2 units side by side. This one also had units above a garage in the rear. This is a totally different approach. It might be a little hard to see, a different approach to that kind of concept with 2 small detached houses in the front of the lot and units above a garage in the rear. And here's yet another sample of, in this case, it's a 4-plex. So a single building with 4 units in it, intended to have an attractive bulk and massing that can fit well within the context of an existing neighborhood. So at this stage, 3 of the 10 submissions have been shortlisted and are currently being revised for further consideration. Once the winners are awarded, staff will look to make recommendations to council on how to change our regulations and processes to permit this form of development. We didn't want to pre-craft zoning regulations that we didn't think might be able to meet the submissions we got. So we're waiting until we give the award to craft the rules custom to the kinds of development that we want to see. Yes?
I'm just wondering if those proposals, are they compliant with current setback regulations, things like that?
Definitely not. They're definitely not compliant with current setback regulations. And I'll tell you a bit about, if you want to ask me a bit more about that after, that's fine. I'd be happy to answer it. So what this means ultimately for our existing neighborhoods and the neighborhoods in the study area is that that there'll be more change in the years to come. So we'll need to make every effort we can to keep the lines of communication open. And I thought there was an apt quote to close my presentation here. For good ideas and true innovation, you need human interaction, conflict, argument, and debate. And despite our best efforts, we know that there will be controversy when it comes to infill housing, but I would suggest that sometimes controversy is a good thing. Thank you. Fiona, not that I know you or anything.
Thanks, James. That was informative. In my single-family suburban home last night, we were having a discussion, and I found an astonishing fact. I don't know if you've heard this, but in America, I don't think it's North America, but in America alone, we've got slightly less than 1 billion parking stalls, which is making up approximately 1% of that land base. Astonishing. That's kind of shocking. So mine, I've got more of a comment than a question, but maybe a point of thought for you that I currently live in suburbia. We have 2 cars. We drive everywhere. And it's our intention as a family of 5 to not be in that location anymore. And I would like to move to one of the town centres in Kelowna. But what we're probably going to do is sell our 10-year-old home, which is basically brand new, move to probably an urban lot, which is probably going to have a house that needs a lot of work done to it. And it's a matter of not if that we're going to do that. We will be doing it. We just don't know when. So what kind of incentive would the City of Kelowna provide to a family like ours to do that?
That's a good question. Well, I don't have an answer for you specifically on I don't know what kind of form of development you're looking for, whether you would want a detached house of your own. Certainly for the infill challenge, the incentives are a bit of a work in progress. The concepts we're working with right now are that we're going to be looking at pre-zoning and accelerated pre-approval for development permit and building permit. So ideally, if you select one of the winning designs of the infill challenge, you can be in and out of City Hall within a week.
Thanks very much. This is really interesting. I'm one that live in a grid neighborhood near the hospital, and I'm not sure one size is going to fit all, but I really appreciate your presentation. I was down in Davis, California, actually to study bicycle roundabouts last month, and had to find a place to stay, and the hotels were all full. It happened to be the American President weekend or something. Anyways, I happened to stay in something called co-housing. I don't know if many of you have heard of this, but it was a weird kind of co-housing. It was formed by a bunch of neighbors in single-family homes taking down their fences. And then, because they were all getting old and becoming empty nesters, they started increasing the number of dwelling units just in their homes. So if you walk through this, all you see is there's no fences and a common backyard, and all the homes look like single-family. But they all have more units in existing what look like single-family homes. It's another way to densify. So I thought, well, wow, maybe co-housing, which is a very European, Scandinavian idea, is something that should also be considered. But I guess that's my comment is have you thought of that? I mean, you're looking at a single lot. And I come from more of a transportation land use system approach. Maybe it's a whole retrofit of a neighborhood, and it has to be different depending on where you are in Kelowna. Going back to this lady's comment, that I live where it's walkable to services. But those folks that might want to age in place, you know, I'm talking to my sisters, we would love to see our place transformed from a single family home to aging in place several units on one lot, because it's a beautiful neighborhood. We don't want to leave the neighborhood. Is that something you can fit in here?
A good question. I think you make a lot of good points. There are a lot of models of housing out there that can help us densify our core areas and that would fit really, really well. The infill challenge isn't a panacea, and it was never intended to provide all the solutions for infill housing. The idea was instead to pick a couple of really good examples that we like, get things started. We know that the conversation is going to evolve from there over the years to come. The point is that where we are today is we're kind of stuck at the carriage house secondary suite stage. And I think the infill challenge is trying here to push us to the next level, to get us thinking about different forms, how different forms of housing can fit in. We're just going to select a couple of winners and provide incentives for those, but we know that as soon as those get in the ground and people start seeing the benefits of it, that new ideas will come forward. And I certainly hope that some of those ideas are around co-housing and other ways of other forms of tenure as well.
Hi, James.
John.
With Kelowna's NIMBYism, with overall height of buildings, I believe this is the direction downtown Kelowna will be moving. Questions though, obviously somebody mentioned it before regarding zoning bylaws obviously don't cater to this type of densification downtown. So is there a plan with the City of Kelowna to eventually look at those zoning bylaws to allow more of this densification?
You're definitely right. What we didn't want to do, and maybe I didn't explain it all that well to begin with, what we didn't want to do here is start with zoning changes without the design yet. We want to make sure that the zoning, if you do that, you're just going to make mistakes. It's going to be us trying to say, here's what we think a good zone would be, but that might not be what the market's demanding. That might not be what builders want to build. That might not be what residents think is sensitive. So rather than starting with zoning changes, we started with getting the design right, and then we'll use that as the basis on which we'll craft our zoning changes. So to answer the other gentleman's question, the competition doesn't have setback requirements. It said, give us your best design that fits these standards about context, about relationship to the street, about open space. And let's use great design and the refinements provided by the submitters about what the market wants and let's let that drive our zoning regulations rather than the other way around.
Just spin off that time, like, probably gonna ask you very much, what's the time frame relating, what's the city's thought, are we talking 5 years doing these types of bylaws, or are we anticipating something here within the next couple of years under the current council?
I'll definitely have it done tomorrow. Probably, I would say tomorrow, maybe the next day. So, right, I mean, and I'm on a spring break, okay, so next week then. So, for the infill challenge area, we're doing the infill challenge. I'm just going to slide back here and give you guys a bit more context about where this is happening. Oh, okay, maybe not just a little bit, but like a long way. Okay, mostly happening in that area, minus the Heritage Conservation Area, the Abbott Marshall Heritage Conservation Area. So we'll be looking at zoning changes right away in those areas over the next few months to a year. How that impacts broader demand for zoning changes elsewhere in the city, I don't know. I don't know what the demand's going to be like. We don't know yet how this process is going to unfold, how residents are going to accept it. So I think a lot remains to be seen from that process to how it'll roll out to the other parts of the city. One of the driving factors behind the choice of these areas, these core areas, to receive infill housing is because, again, of that grid network that exists that can really accept more density in a way that's a bit more context sensitive. Trying to fit in that kind of density in curvilinear road networks in the suburbs, much harder. So I don't even know if there's all that much potential beyond these areas to consider the same kind of approach that we would do here.
A question for developers and realtors in the audience. Could we use this design competition, in your opinions, to show that there is a strong market demand for dense, urban, family-centered housing ideal for working parents? Please.
Sort of steal your thunder here, James. I'm actually in the process of developing an urban development. That's 2 of our submissions were in the infill challenge. And we have a 4-unit row home project downtown. It was traditionally on a single family RU6 lot. Our first buyers are a 30-something. She's pregnant. He's a doctor. So no question that there's an absolute demand and appetite. This came to me literally off the development side. No marking on it. So there's a real world answer for you.
Maybe I can just add to that. I think we crafted this competition purposely to encourage that people who would submit would be in teams that would have developers, realtors, designers on them, so that they would work together, and you get a submission that would be something that the market would want and would get picked up, and maybe that they would even build themselves. So hopefully it lands on the ground quickly. And I think when it comes to family housing, that's an important component of neighborhoods. But the infill challenge itself is also looking at introducing a full variety of units and tenures. I think the ultimate vision of the neighborhood from the city of Kelowna's perspective is a diverse neighborhood that maybe has housing for families, that has housing for seniors, that has housing for rent and to own, all those kinds of things, in a diverse block where you get a real sense of community out of it.
Just in the actual challenge itself, was there any consideration for environmental aspects as on-site water collection, or was it up to each individual developer to introduce it or not?
Up to each individual developer.
Okay.
Thanks, James. Just have a question and maybe a comment on the map that you show. So as a multifamily developer builder, I look at the map and I see, the area, the parts of Kelowna that could take the most density, right? It's right downtown, near the hospital, along Highway 97, and putting urban infill in those areas would be, I think, a tragedy on half the area, not the whole area, just because you're now neutering the opportunity to really provide more housing on land. So maybe you have any thoughts on that?
I do. We're one step ahead of you, Randy. This is a really generalized map. The infill challenge area actually doesn't apply to any lands designated multi-unit. It's all to single 2-unit residential areas. So our low density single family neighborhoods in the core area are the ones that we're targeting, not the areas that are designated for multi-unit development, medium or high density, because of that very reason.
Full disclosure, to answer your question, Miss, we have a submission in the infill challenge, and we're designing it as 2 3-bedroom homes for families. There's 4 units in total. The other home is likely a 2-bedroom, and the other one's a 1-bedroom. So it's very diverse as far as who it can satisfy, be it renters or owners, and really wanted to focus a young family. So we're price pointing it at that point too.
Okay, I'll let you guys have some lunch now. Oh, one last question, okay?
Yeah, how does the city plan to incentivize existing dwellers to make the transition to multi-unit development and zoning?
That's a tough question. I think overall, we can't force existing owners to want to redevelop. Redevelopment of these neighborhoods, even if we're successful in the infill challenge going forward, is going to take a really long time. It's going to be as residents choose to sell or choose to see a great enough financial return that they want to develop. We can't. The only way we can help with that is with things like processing incentives. So that's what we've tried to consider here: is how can we make these designs more attractive. If we take out some of the risk from zoning, if we take out some of the time required through typical development approvals, then that can help with make the economics of it more attractive. And if the economics of it more attractive, hopefully more existing residents will choose to redevelop or to sell to somebody who does want to redevelop. But I think our expectation should be that it's going to take a long time for these neighborhoods to transition. Well, thanks everybody.
We're unfortunately out of time for discussion, but happily it's lunchtime, and there's nothing better for discussion than a nice meal to share. Thank you, James. We had a great response to registration, more than we had anticipated, since this is our first such event, and we unfortunately had to limit participation in the lunch and breakout sessions to the first 100 who signed up. That being said, I've had a few people drop out at the last minute, so if there are people who are not able to sign up and who would be interested in sticking around for lunch and breakout sessions, please come see me. I can probably take 5 or 6 people. So do come see me. Those who are signed up for lunch should go to the arts building across the lawn to the atrium. I have posted volunteers along the way to guide you there. Once you get there, get your lunch and then look for the sign that has your breakout group on it. And your breakout group is on your name tag. If you look at the back of your program, I put down some discussion questions to get you started. I wasn't too prescriptive because I think everyone here has things they've come equipped to talk about, and the goal is really to provide you with an opportunity to share your ideas. For the rest of you, please note that there are many concessions on campus where you can grab a lunch, and if you don't know where they are, there's a map at the registration table that you can pick up. If you are leaving us now, thanks for joining us. Please discard your name tags. We'll reuse them at the registration desk, and there's a box there too for the surveys, and we would really appreciate feedback. And the rest of you, we'll see you back at 2 p.m. in Library 305, and you are actually allowed to bring coffee into that classroom. Have a great lunch.